All right, welcome to Learning with Mr. Ruck. I'm Mr. Ruck Dashel, still. All right, so today is part four, the final part in our four-part series about a little glimpse into the life of what it would have been like to live during the Civil War. And we've heard some accounts of soldiers already. We've heard a little bit from Abraham Lincoln, and we've heard a lot, sort of like the narrator for this story, from Reverend McCauley. And he is the Reverend of the town of Chattanooga, and he tells it like it is, account by count, minute by minute, of what's going on. And we've learned some surprising things. And today, I would say that there's less surprise and more thunder and lightning because the fighting is about to begin. Let's history. So life goes on. Again, Reverend McCauley brings us up to date. During these days, I remained mostly indoors and never went out on the streets, except in case of real necessity. It was almost like being in prison. We saw no papers, had very little contact with anyone, and consequently knew but little of the big movement of armies going on all around us. The waves of this army invasion flowed like water right up around our house. Remember, our fences and outhouses were gone, and our house stood, as it were, on the common. One lieutenant, an Irishman, asked our permission to spread his tent in the southwest corner of our yard. We very readily granted it. Others, without permission, camped out on our porch in front of our house. Our garden was filled with camps, so that we were besieged in our own house. They were so close to us as they could hear every word that was uttered from our house, including all family prayers. Monday, September 21st. There was commotion in the army among the camp followers, almost bordering on panic. The Federals had been defeated and driven back into the city. They expected every hour to see the triumphant Confederates come pouring into the city, capturing and driving everything before them. All day long, the Federals were getting their wagon trains across the river on pontoon bridges in anticipation of a possible surrender. But the day wore away without any demonstration on the part of Bragg's army. Remember, he's the Confederate general. That night, Monday, the axes rang out all night on the great fine oaks and hickories that grew around the city. All night we could hear the crashing and falling of the great trees. The next morning, I walked out on McCauley Avenue as far as Douglas Street and did not know the country. Hundreds of acres of fine timbered land lay naked, denuded of its fine forests in one night, the trees lying with their tops toward the foe. Trenches were dug and being dug in, which and behind which the Federals could fight. And by Tuesday night, the morale of the army was restored. The town was fortified. The Confederates could not overthrow it. Bragg had lost his great opportunity, had won a bloodless battle at a tremendous loss. So he has this quote from Bragg, and it's not really a quote. It's a quote from McCauley about Bragg. So Bragg says, or he says that Bragg has lost his great opportunity and won a bloodless battle at a tremendous loss. What he's saying there is that this was the opportunity. The Union had come running back into the town defeated with their tail between their legs, and they expected, because they knew they weren't ready to be attacked. And instead, in this bloodless battle, there is no attack, there's no blood. And in missing out on the opportunity to fight the Union, Bragg loses the battle. Because during this time then, the Union soldiers essentially fortify the whole town. They make it so that it'll be difficult to take now. And in doing so, their spirit is boosted. And they're ready to fight once again. Okay, so Reverend McCauley continues to share the events of the town, and specifically, a decisive battle begins. The Confederate forces occupied the heights of Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain, and carried their battle lines in Lookout Valley. Every now and then, a shell from Lookout Mountain would fall into the city. The Federals were so badly besieged and hemmed in that they had to drive the wagons great distances. Their provisions grew scarce. Their soldiers were placed on very skimpy rations, so also their horses and mules. As the siege grew worse and the supplies shorter, the teamsters, in order to save the lives of their animals, cut down all our peach, pear, apple, and plum trees and fed their stock on the twigs and bark. In spite of all this, as time wore on, the animals died in increasing numbers every day. Dead mules and horses were in sight everywhere. So in other words, didn't have anything to feed all their animals with, so they tried to feed them on branches and twigs, and they still ended up dying and just piled them up around the streets and throughout the town. It was an awful time. Scarcity reigned everywhere. Not a pound of meal or rice or flour or potatoes could buy you a bag. Not a loaf of bread or anything to eat. The churches and large warehouses and old stores were filled with sick and wounded men. One morning at the Baptist church, I saw a pile of legs and arms lying on the porch, the very sight of which was appalling. Going on inside, I saw a surgeon taking off a man's leg so quickly that it amazed me. The Confederate sick and wounded prisoners were in a large warehouse on Market Street, in the center of which was a big fire to keep them warm. But as there was no chimney, the smoke was so stifling that the cold was preferable. Here, my wife and I and many other citizens daily went carrying large bowls of soup for these poor men. So in other words, these people that have had their town taken away from them, they're actually feeding the people that have taken their town. They were glad to get the soup and to hear a word of sympathy from those who were of kindred sentiments with themselves. In other words, they wanted the same thing. They wanted the Union soldiers to win. Shows you just how divided it was in the South, even about whether to secede or not to secede, because slavery was not really widely supported. It was just by those large, rich plantations that made it seem like it was widely supported. It is now November 23rd, 1863. I stood on the hill and witnessed the Battle of Lookout Mountain. Could you imagine that? Watching a battle. Federal cannons were being fired from Moccasin Point across the river and against the mountain where the Confederates were. I could distinctly see the long files of Union soldiers as they marched on the side of the mountain, and could see the flash of their guns and hear the roll of their noise as platoon after platoon fired on slowly retreating Confederates. For by and by it began to rain, and the mist settled down the mountains so that the forces engaged were concealed from sight. In other words, there's such thick fog that no one can be seen. At night, the rain ceased. The clouds lifted, and yet the firing kept up. At 9 o'clock that night, I could, from my yard, see the blaze of the guns and hear the small arms quite distinctly. This battle is called in history the Battle Above the Clouds, because of the mists that pervaded from about 11 in the morning till near nightfall. And here we have our conclusion. At night, it was a terrible but a magnificent sight. The crest of the ridge fairly blazed with cannon and the flash of small arms. 4 battle lines pressed toward the ridge. It was only a little while later, after the battle began, till a long line of ambulances with wounded men came into the city. The roar of the guns was terrific. Presently, we could see the Federal battle pressing right up beside the Missionary Ridge, and the Confederates firing directly down on them. This did not last long, till we could see explosion after explosion on top of the ridge. Powder smoke rising up in great volumes. So soon as this occurred, a great multitude of spectators standing on the hill where I was raised a shout of triumph that I did not understand. Turning to a man that stood near me, I said, What are they shouting about? He said, "Don't you see? The Rebs are blowing up their magazines and retreating." So in other words, it wasn't just Reverend McCauley here who we think is the sympathizer to the Union. It's actually most of the townspeople. All of these people watching are actually cheering when they see that the rebels have been defeated. They're having to blow up all of their ammunitions and retreat. And why would they do that? Because they don't want the Union to be able to take all of their guns, weapons, and extras that they've brought in. But in order to retreat, they'll need to retreat quickly, and they don't have time to take them with them. Okay, so the interesting thing to think about is this story that's a true account from Reverend McCauley, what he does really to put us into this story, make it feel like we're a part of it. It's his perspective that he's talking as if he sees everything. It's that old classic thing of show, don't tell. And he describes everything to us, from the mist to the flashes to the sounds. It's all right there. I know I would not react the same. If there was a battle going on, I would not go try to get the best spot to watch. I would get as far away from that as possible. Reverend McCauley, you are crazy. I mean, not really crazy, but I would never do that. So, what happens next then? That's the question. Does our town return to the way it was? Do the Union soldiers leave the town after they've just fought so hard to win it? Obviously, we know where the South goes. Thinking about the year that this happens, 63, we're really only in the middle of the war. The Union's not going to be interested in giving up this town. All right, that's been part 4. Final conclusion to life and an account of what it would have been like during the Civil War. Basically, everyone was starving. Everyone was cold, including the soldiers and the people in the towns that were occupied by those soldiers. And it's interesting because the Union and the Confederates are going back and forth between these towns, fighting amongst themselves. And it just seems, when you look at it from this point of view, kind of pointless. Pointless not because it's pointless to give freedom to slaves. It's pointless that we had to do a whole war for it that in one battle killed more people than the whole Revolutionary War did. But that's been the theme of this whole series of videos. Why did we have to do this? I know it's unfortunate, but what's hopefully happened because of this is with these videos you've learned a little bit. I know that in preparing for these videos I've had to learn quite a bit myself, and quite a bit of it has surprised me, and I hope that you found it to be the same. We will see you next time, and if you got something out of this like I hope you did, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you when I see you. Peace.